Hello and welcome to the Writers and Books Visiting Author Series. My name is Dan Hurd. I'm the Director of Adult Programs. Writers and Books is a nonprofit literary arts center in Rochester, New York. We offer readings, workshops, and literary programming for people of all ages, all currently available online. Our theme for 2021 is Taking Care. We're celebrating different ways we can take care of ourselves and take care of others this year. You can check out our upcoming schedule at wab.org. Please say hello in the chat and let us know you're there. Feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function. Books are available through our bookstore, &Books. I'll put the link in the chat. We're so excited to have Piper Sledge with us today. First, we'll hear her read, then she'll be in conversation with Allison Kavey. Allison Kavey is a professor of early modern history, history of science, and history of medicine at CUNY John Jay College and the CUNY Graduate Center. Piper Sledge is an assistant professor of sociology and director of gender and sexuality studies at Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania. Her book, Bodies Unbound, is a well-researched narrative about the relationship between bodies and gender. Drawing on the experiences of individuals whose bodies and gender identities don't match medical and social expectations, she explores how ideologies of gendered bodies shape medical care. As the author Lisa Jean Mawr has said, Sledge's fieldwork has led to a rich and vibrant analysis of how gender is enacted, resisted, performed, and policed in medical settings. Her accessible writing style and complex sociological analysis make this a powerful and unique contribution to the field. Piper, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. And thanks for everybody who joined the Zoom tonight. And thanks to everybody else at Writers and Books for helping to put this together. And also thanks to Allison Kavey for leading our conversation later tonight. So I'll begin with an origin story about this project. So as is the case with a great deal of sociological research, I started this project where I was, which at the time was a person employed at a forestry nonprofit, listening to transgender friends lament the medical care they received or didn't. I had a master's degree in natural resources. I had studied sociology and gender studies as an undergrad, and I had a lifetime of uncomfortable medical encounters. I was also adjacent to a medical school grappling with a case of homophobia among students, and I watched how this was handled with great interest, and so I decided to go to graduate school again. Now, sociologists start research from where we are, and then we ask, what is this a case of? So the answer to this question led to the book that I'll read from tonight. Bodies Unbound considers the perpetuation of normative gender ideologies through the medical regulation of patient bodies and the challenges gender nonconforming people experience when seeking medical care. In the book, I explore the relationships between patient identities, gender embodiment, and resistance to these ideologies and regulations through an expansion of the concept of bio-legitimacy to specifically account for gender. This move allows for the consideration of how the meanings and value of gender may be reproduced or reimagined within daily life in the context of the locus of gender's biopower, the medical community. So I weave this analysis with and through the stories of 57 people whose bodies and gender identities do not match the medical and cultural expectations for gynecological and breast cancer prevention and care. I link together the experiences of transgender men seeking routine gynecological cancer screenings, cisgender men diagnosed with breast cancer, and cisgender women who request bilateral mastectomies and refuse breast reconstruction following a breast cancer or BRCA diagnosis. The folks who shared their stories created gender trouble for medical professionals by being men in so-called women's medical spaces and women who refuse medical care predicated on an implicit ideal of breasted femininity. These stories together show how certain configurations of bodies and gender identities come to be understood as legitimate and intelligible through interactions with medical professionals, family, friends, and strangers. Fundamentally, Bodies Unbound is a story about gender, the meanings we associate with it, and the ways we acquiesce, resist, imagine possibilities, and otherwise participate in these processes as patients and practitioners. I begin the book by asserting that the gender profession has a medical problem, but it's not the gender problem we might first assume. That is a problem of gender disparities in who becomes a physician, a nurse, a physician's assistant, et cetera, or of disparities in specialty. My reading will include excerpts illustrating this gender problem from the perspectives of research participants who chose contralateral mastectomies and refused breast reconstruction. Breasts are a culturally significant marker of womanhood, and breast cancer is culturally understood not only as a major health risk, but also as a threat to femininity. Whether breast cancer or BRCA has been diagnosed, cisgender women confront a series of decisions about what sort of medical interventions they should pursue, including the possibility of prophylactic or contralateral mastectomy. In making these decisions, cis women may find themselves in tension with physicians and with ideologies of gender. Sorry, I've lost my place in the book. Here we go. When women make these decisions, it should be noted that they are only, these decisions about mastectomies are only recommended by physicians for those who have tested positive for BRCA, not for women who have been diagnosed with breast cancer. At the heart of women's narratives about BRCA and breast cancer was the anxiety caused by the increased frequency of mammograms and other such early detection measures after diagnosis. Choosing a bilateral mastectomy meant an end to an annual cycle of worry for the women who participated in this study. As Fran, a retired scientist with a history of suspicious mammograms and a breast cancer diagnosis, explained, "It was just like I've had enough of this. I just wanted to get rid of the whole situation. I just don't want this worry all the time." For Fran, the yearly cycle of a suspicious mammogram followed by various additional tests had created a great deal of anxiety. A pragmatist, she ultimately decided that removing the breast tissue would remove the worry associated with annual mammograms of her remaining breast. Katie, a BRCA-positive participant, explained, "I had this real love-hate relationship with my breasts. I loved them, but I was afraid of them. I was afraid of what they could do. I was afraid of what was inside of them." Fran's and Katie's fears were echoed by all the women in this study. Women with a breast cancer diagnosis wondered whether lumpectomy, chemotherapy, or radiation would eradicate the entire tumor, whether chemotherapy or radiation would have long-term side effects, and whether the cancer would return or spread to the other breast. Both the women with breast cancer and those with positive BRCA tests worried that abnormal mammograms, combined with sometimes numerous rounds of follow-up tests, would create intense stress. These concerns cannot be resolved by current medical knowledge, and thus were fundamental catalysts for the women who chose contralateral mastectomies. Other women expressed doubts that the breast cancer treatments would be effective over the long term. Susie's doctors tried to talk her out of the mastectomy, arguing they could remove the tumor and rule out recurrence through radiation treatments. Susie was uneasy with this approach. "It would have just been too stressful for me to wonder if it's all gone and is the radiation really killing it?" Concern about the efficacy of radiation or chemotherapy and subsequent side effects was widespread among study participants. For these women, mastectomies produced far less anxiety than a lumpectomy combined with radiation and/or chemotherapy. Linda wanted medical intervention to be as short-term as possible. Speaking about her options of lumpectomy and radiation or mastectomy, she said, "I wanted to avoid it, radiation, at all costs. And my surgeon said, if you have a mastectomy, you won't have to have radiation." I actually had to go home and let it register and call her back and say, "Did I hear you correctly that if I have a mastectomy, I won't have to have radiation?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Sign me up. It's going to be a double." So most women did not have physicians who were as supportive as Linda's. Only 2 other women in the study had recounted experiences with supportive physicians. Maggie, a competitive athlete, never liked her breasts and considered them discordant with her identity as genderqueer, though she did use she, her pronouns. As soon as she was diagnosed with cancer, Maggie knew that she wanted her breasts removed. The second they told me there would be a surgical plan, I said, "Well, then I'm going to do a bilateral mastectomy." And to be 100% honest, I never really liked my boobs anyway. Never liked having boobs, and I had boobs. The surgeons didn't question me at all. They were like, "Okay, then that's totally appropriate." And they moved on. I think that I had a relatively unique experience. I talked to other people, and the sheer number of people who tell me that there was resistance to doing the bilateral because the other breast is healthy, my doctors were clearly able to meet me where I was and respect me as the person that I presented myself to be. Colleen's oncologist support was crucial in her decision to have a bilateral mastectomy. The new oncologist I was referred to was a woman, and I feel like she was maybe a little more sympathetic than the men I had seen. She actually brought mastectomy up when I met with her for the first time. She was like, if I was in your position, I would do it in a heartbeat. And that was like sort of the validation that, you know, telling me it's totally appropriate. You're not crazy. You're not overreacting. Recovering from breast cancer, following all the treatments, which in the case of the folks I interviewed included mastectomies, can be a fraught process. After having a bilateral mastectomy as part of this treatment decision, women face a number of decisions about breast reconstruction. And reconstruction in the United States is typically framed as the way to restore femininity after a breast cancer diagnosis. Central to the biomedical framing of breast reconstruction is the idea that patients will have breast reconstruction if offered, and if they're provided with examples of how successful surgery can be. Patients are provided with formal information about reconstructive options, and physicians also told those that I interviewed that reconstruction is the, quote, fun part, unquote, of breast cancer. Katie's doctor told her, you get a mastectomy, you get new breasts, and you get a tummy tuck. Many women find great pleasure in being breasted, and breast reconstruction can be central to restoring a sense of self after the physical and emotional difficulties of breast cancer. When faced with the possibility of mastectomies, many of the women I interviewed turned to the internet to search for images of both reconstructed breasts and flat post-mastectomy chests, because medical providers failed to offer information about living flat. After seeing all of these images and understanding the specifics of breast reconstruction as presented by physicians, several women expressed sentiments similar to, but not always as colorful as Edie. Her response to reconstructive surgery after viewing images on the internet was, not on my fucking life. Despite their desire and informed intent to live flat, the women I interviewed reported that physicians made great efforts to convince them to have surgery. Fran had to watch a video extolling the benefits of reconstruction before making her final decisions. She found the video offensive. It was infuriating to me after having made the decision to live flat, to have this tape that seemed to imply that I had made the wrong decision because all these people were so happy, and now I was going to be unhappy for the rest of my life. Catherine had to undergo expensive psychological testing when she told her doctor that she wanted to live flat. My doctors were kind of floored that I would want to spend the rest of my life without reconstruction, and I felt as though they kept on pushing it throughout my entire chemotherapy experience. It was a constant questioning of my mental state and my decision-making process. Linda's doctor asked her simply, do you want to be mutilated? So living flat opens space for a critical examination of feminine beauty. That women who live flat see their bodies as beautiful and not mutilated creates a stark contrast to how they view reconstructed breasts. Edie, who was appalled at the images she saw, also said, I started looking at these things and I'm like, holy shit, because to my way of thinking, this stuff looked horrific. I mean, we cancer ladies, we like to call them Franken-boobies. I mean, the idea of having foreign material under my skin is a hideous thought to me. And then when I realized that for the surgery, they actually disconnect your pectoral muscle to stick the silicone under the muscle, I was like, are they fucking kidding me? I mean, not only does it hurt like hell, but women who do this have diminished function. Sandy was especially concerned about her muscle function after bilateral mastectomy. She said, I like my muscles the way they are. I'm a competitive athlete. I'm scrawny enough that the only reconstruction they could have done would have been the expanders. And do not mess with my pecs. Thank you very much. Alternatively, if I had had the body fat, I wouldn't have wanted my core disturbed for a tram. I would not have wanted someone to play with my lats. Breasts are so much less important to me than having the integrity of my muscles. Sandy felt that breast reconstruction was too insulting to the body, given the added risk of infection and the pain associated with the procedure. An insult to the body is specifically an affront to the body's integrity. This sentiment is evident in the frequency with which women who live flat express that their bodies have been put through enough. Kate, who initially had implants, deconstructed her breasts after a string of complications. She articulated the commonly held feeling among flat women that her body was threatened by medical procedures. You kind of feel like you want to own something and you need some agency, right? So it's like, all right, I'm losing the breast. I'll get back the breast. I'll do reconstruction. Like people tell you, you know, you do chemo, you lose your hair, but it comes back. You're not prepared that you're metamorphosing, right? You're kind of thinking you've got to go back to where you were. You're hanging on to life here, and you think that life as you have known it before is better than the scary life that's being proposed. After the complications with Reconstruction, I was just like, enough, enough. Stay away from my breasts or lack of breasts. Stay away from my body. I don't want anything invading. It was awful. In this quote, Kate posited Reconstruction as a return to her physical state before mastectomy. Like regrowing hair after chemo, Kate believed that her healthcare providers presented breast reconstruction after mastectomy as a procedure that would restore her body to normal. Once the reality of Reconstruction set in, the unnaturalness of mounds and the health risk complications, Kate had to rethink bodily integrity. She became adamant about Reconstruction as threatening, feeling strongly that physicians needed to stay away from her breasts. So here, beauty and mutilation here are in the eyes of the beholder. In the context of medical decision-making, providers have a heightened degree of power in determining the course of care. Medical practices are embedded within the gender system, and as such are influenced by and reinforce commonly held beliefs about what it means to be a man or a woman. These beliefs are specifically tied to the physical body, and accordingly, the authority of medical providers becomes critical in rendering legitimate and recognizable a patient's gender, while at the same time reaffirming normative expectations for appropriately gendered bodies. Medical care presumes a particular alignment of gender identity, body, and treatment. When these components are out of alignment, medical practitioners must alter some combination of the treatment plan, the treatment interaction, or the patient's body. These practices are embedded within the gender system, and as such are influenced by cultural ideologies of gender. Medical care is thus both shaped by ideas about gender and also reproduces those beliefs through the bodies of patients. The stories shared in this book prompt a question. How do we change medical culture to adapt to and respect the changing needs of the patient population? Medicine is a social institution with important ramifications for the social structures that organize social life. Medical interactions require categorizing bodies as ill or healthy, normal or pathological, treatable or untreatable. Accordingly, the production of medical knowledge and the provision of healthcare are based on and reinforce definitions of normal bodies. So what then is at stake in understanding the role of gender ideologies in medical care? This is not just a concern for gender and sexual minorities. Rather, because biocitizenship is predicated on our standing as women and men, the influence of gender ideologies and gendered embodiment in particular is central to the medical interactions every person has throughout their lifetime. Normative expectations about gendered embodiment, bodily practices, and identity shape medical care at its core. And the a priori and instantaneous categorization of patients determines what diagnoses and recommendations are made. It's hard to be hopeful after hearing the stories of individuals who felt that their desires and questions were dismissed by medical professionals, and after reading medical scholarship that often discounts the kinds of story told in this book. But there's an underlying strength and power in these stories. Although the clinic can feel like an isolating experience, and patients may feel alone as they advocate for embodiments that feel right, but have not acquired a wide degree of legitimacy, it is through the resistance and redefinition of meaning for which individual patients fight that change may occur. The more each patient advocates for themselves, the more difficult it will become for the medical profession to ignore the types of change that desires for alternative embodiments require. Instead of optimism or despair, I offer this prognosis for the future. Any change that may occur in the operation of biopower in the context of medicine will need to be a joint effort between patients and providers, with patients serving as the primary catalyst for change. But unless the imbalance of power and knowledge and decision-making authority between patients and providers is reconciled through intentional effort, the rate of change will be slow indeed. Gender matters, and the materiality of gender matters. These matter to patients and to providers. Medicine will need to play catch-up for the foreseeable future to match the pace of change that gender-expansive people require. Thank you.
Thank you very much for what I felt was a fascinating book. As you know, I'm a historian. Sorry, the dogs, they'll shut up in a second. I'm a historian, and I've primarily trained in the early modern period. but I have been working on bioethics quite a bit, so I'm going to try to keep up with you. And please excuse me if I'm too slow and I'm a bit behind. I just want to start with a quick personal narrative. I recently had ankle surgery, and I went in and they said, "Oh, you have to have a pregnancy test." I said, the likelihood of my being pregnant is extremely low. And she said, "Oh, well, it doesn't matter. If you have a uterus, you have to have a pregnancy test." And at the time I thought, this is so stupid. It's biologically impossible for me to be pregnant. I know my body better than you do, lady, but it's 7:30 in the morning. I'm not going to fight with you about this. And I don't think my sexual identity or my gender identity is your business, and I refuse to engage with this. And then I read your book, and I thought, well, I wish I had stood up and said, this is ridiculous, because if I looked like a man, you would not have told me that. And so I wanted to start with this notion of biocitizenship and biolegitimacy. These are two terms that are central to your book. And I wanted you to just talk me through what you mean by those two things. Quite specifically, how does one become biolegitimate in a medical context?
These are definitely, the critical kind of theoretical contribution of the book, right? So especially the question of how does one become biolegitimate, right? This is kind of the thread that runs through the book to try to figure out, not necessarily to argue that gendered biolegitimacy is a thing, but to think about it as a process and how this process of becoming works, and then hopefully in future work to carry those threads out. So, so biocitizenship is a term that actually started, I'm going to flub the name of the theorist, but she was writing about Chernobyl and the impacts of the nuclear reactor and what those health issues had on people as citizens. And then this concept is kind of taken on its own life, as these terms often do, right? So biocitizenship is about sort of the ways that our bodies and health become implicated in our ability to be full functional citizens of a particular polity, right? And it expands out into things that we don't necessarily think of as politics, like consumption of health products or medical care and all these sorts of things. So it plays into all of who we are as decision makers and who is allowed to make decisions, right? So there's the work of biocitizenship kind of expands across all sorts of matters, like health refugees in France, from North Africa, all of these different pieces. And so how people kind of move across political boundaries and within political boundaries. So biolegitimacy is, right, so we've got biopower, biopolitics, bioethics, all of these terms that roughly descend from Foucault and sort of pass out into the rest of social science thinking, right? About how bodies are disciplined, punished, rewarded. And so biolegitimacy is part of being viewed as a intelligible whole, right? So each of these moments, like the one you described, Allison, of going to the surgeon and having this pregnancy test, right? That story comes up often. I think every trans man I talked to had some version of it too, right? And so that is sort of a breakdown in biolegitimacy, right? Your knowledge of yourself and your body is not legitimate in the eyes of medical gatekeepers, right? So this is kind of part of what I'm looking at. And so for my work, I'm looking at different pieces of this biolegitimacy puzzle that if we think about sort of the history of where the idea of gender came from, part of that is from the medical community, right? So Jemima Repo has a great book called The Biopolitics of Gender, tracing this history, right? But So at any rate, part of our biolegitimacy, so our ability to connect our gender identity and our bodies, happens through medicine historically and currently. But it also gets reinforced in all of these moments in our social interaction. So in other parts of the book, I talk about ways that people's partners, spouses, kids, coworkers either sort of are able to perceive folks as they are or not, and what consequences those have for the folks I interviewed. So biolegitimacy is really about these moments of conjunction and disruption in who we see ourselves to be, how we embody that, and how we're perceived in those ways by other people, particularly those with certain kinds of power. And this is particularly important, right? You know, if we think about trans folks, you have to go through these medical gatekeepers to get official documentation, right? To get your driver's license, to have your gender markers be what you need them to be, right? So these are all different layers of that biolegitimacy, or illegitimacy, as the case may be, when we have to try to find other avenues to be whole, active biocitizens, right? If your gender marker on your ID doesn't match your voting record and all of these things, right? As a very obvious example of citizenship, then things start to break down. So they're all interconnected.
So one of the things that I wanted to actually talk about was something you've just referenced, which is how your body's appearance for some people that you interviewed or that you worked with was a way of navigating anxiety related to a diagnosis. So specifically for the women who chose to have reconstruction, some of that was because they didn't want people to feel uncomfortable looking at them and to say, I don't know who you are in our gender binary system.
Mm-hmm.
As far as I could tell from your book, very few of those women decided based on their own sense of their bodies. It was an external evaluation based on their sense of biolegitimacy, where their body should match other people's expectations of what they should look like. Interestingly, as far as I could tell, trans men who have already had to struggle to navigate across this gender binary had a different approach, which was to say, please recognize my external body as matching my internal body. Is that a parallel that you have found in any other area of your work, or that you might explore in future work? Because I found it fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, so the different approaches to how to manage these interactions, the clinical interactions, and make decisions about one's body, right? There were some patterns. And there's sort of these interesting kind of patterns about how people orient to the gender binary, right? So trans men have a slightly different orientation to the gender binary than, say, the cis men in the book, right? For another point of comparison. But this question of recognition and what that recognition means is kind of critical, right? So most of the trans men in their lives outside of the medical clinic, right, had no problems with recognition. They were deemed biolegitimate by the people who mattered to them. And the only time that broke down was in clinical settings, right? And their anxiety, what they told me in those clinical settings, was not what the medical community assumed, right? There are all of these medical texts talking about anxiety for trans men, right? Particularly with gynecological care. And the assumption in those texts is that trans men are uncomfortable with their bodies, when in fact, they're just uncomfortable with the providers. Mm-hmm. And, you know, this takes comes to a different result with the cis women who had breast reconstruction, right? There was a combination of feeling like they wouldn't be able to recognize themselves if they lived flat, but part of that was because of these social interactions where they were worried about the people in their lives being able to recognize them. And so without some kind of mirror, it was harder and harder to make the choice to do anything but reconstruction. There were instances with the women who lived flat where partner or child recognition or something really mattered, right? So those stories came up too. One in particular was a woman who I call Catherine in the book. And she decided that her body was beautiful and sexy and wonderful, and she was going to make certain that her spouse knew that. And so she decreed that she would just walk around naked in her house until that recognition came, right? So this question of recognition really is quite critical, and where people feel like they have the power to ask for that recognition, to demand it, and where they don't. And you know, I haven't considered that as a next research project, but now that you mentioned, I think it would be really cool. But I think, you know, those where recognition can happen and where we can ask for it or not matters. And, you know, I think there's some of this rhetoric of choice, right? That we can choose our bodies, and that's a really important choice. But it's also worth considering where that choice is more or less evident for folks in this process of searching for recognition.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about scars, because that's another form of discourse that I found fascinating in this book. And I guess I saw two ways in which the scars left from surgery could be markers. And there was one that you talked about quite a bit, and that was the scars of women who had a double mastectomy or bilateral mastectomy and then chose not to reconstruct. And those scars were visible. They were markers of their fight against cancer. They often identified those scars as a badge of courage and a survivor status symbol. For women who chose reconstruction, they were actually told that the scars would be very small, that you could minimize your status as a survivor. No one would have to know. Of course, that is not true. No matter how good the surgery is, you can certainly tell that those breasts are not the original breasts. And I wondered what you made of this discourse of scars. And I have a follow-up to this, but please just take it from here for a bit.
So I was also really fascinated by this, particularly several of the women who lived flat. The images that they found on the internet, they would talk about things like the Scar Project by David J. He's a fashion photographer, but did this incredible project taking portraits of women who had had breast cancer and showing what scars really look like, right? Because whether we know people have breast cancer or not, we almost never actually see what the results of the surgery look like. We don't see mastectomy scars. We don't see breast reconstruction, right? And breast reconstruction is very different than like breast implants. And so in the book, there are some images to kind of show the impact of the body of breast reconstruction, right? Because it's not just scars on the chest. If you have these flat procedures, there's scars on your back, there's scars on your abdomen, there's scars on your thighs, your hips, your buttocks, right? All of these different places. So there's all these different ways that scars play into the breast cancer experience. And what was really striking to me was the women who looked at these images online of reconstructed breasts and flat chests and said, I want scars that are beautiful, right? I want a surgeon who's going to go in and just, you know, have these very precise lines. And even if they're big, they're beautiful, right? Or I want really beautiful scars that I can then do this really cool tattoo design with, right? Whereas for the women who reconstructed, they really wanted it was all about minimal scars, right? And a lot of the women who were BRCA positive talked about their mothers and the scars that their mothers had from breast cancer, from mastectomies, and how they didn't want those. And they felt that choosing bilateral mastectomy and then choosing reconstruction was a way to ensure the most aesthetically pleasing outcome. But then aesthetics got all turned around with the women who lived flat, where symmetrical scars were beautiful and aesthetically pleasing, right? So there's all these different ways that scars matter way beyond this idea that they're like the battle scars, right? They get transformed into this sort of beautiful part of a person's aesthetic. And there's all these stories, particularly the women who live flat, for how they sort of came to accept the scars as part of themselves, right? How they became integrated in their identity. But what's also interesting is that the cis men had a really hard time with scars because surgeons felt like it didn't matter, right? It didn't matter if the guys had these scars that were all kind of, you know, jagged and wonky because, you know, it just made them look like tough guys. But a lot of the men were like, I don't, like, if I take off my shirt at the beach, people are going to freak out, you know, people are going to be afraid. And that, so scars didn't play out the way that sort of the media makes us think that the scars will play out. And I think I've gotten away from your question, but.
No, I think it's important to sort of go through that, right? It's multiple iterations of what scars mean. And I think as you say, the Susan Komen breast cancer fundraising research efforts have really made the idea of a survivor, a pink ribbon, very pretty, very femme woman who has overcome, who has survived, and who is unmarked. And I think it's that idea of being unmarked as opposed to choosing being marked that was fascinating to me, because in your quest for biolegitimacy, choice does seem to matter. And choice matters more as biocitizenship becomes linked to biolegitimacy, as I understand it, because you cannot be a citizen without making a series of choices, but you're not considered a legitimate citizen until your body matches the gender that is assigned to you. So you have to accumulate scars in order to do that. And I would argue that you actually present us with a very traditional narrative of women, traditionally gendered women who are biologically childbearing, choosing to demonstrate their scars and then recognizing the scars of breast cancer as part of that femininity. They said, well, I have stretch marks from having children. I forget which person said this, but I have stretch marks from having children. I have cellulite on my thighs, and now I have breast cancer scars. This is a way of being female in the world. I have chosen to be a biologically reproductive woman, and these are the results. And so, I mean, I actually was sort of thinking about this as the estrogen tax, that your body becomes this map of scars that are all the tolls you've paid to get to this point in your life. And then I thought about the choice of accumulating new scars to become the body that matches your gender. And so for me, and I understand it's a bit of a cliched reference, but Hedwig and the Angry Inch in the soundtrack, you know, it says, look at all these scars all across my body. I have co-written a book on Frankenstein. I acknowledge a sort of obsession with created bodies, but the ability to subject yourself to scarring to become the body that matches your identity is a fascinating one. And the fact that the scars are not respected by the people who produce them is in some ways the crux of your medical issue here. The medical gatekeepers can't look at the scars and understand what it took to become that body. They want you to match the box of born biologically female, performing biologically feminine, and gender feminine. And if you can't do those things, then you disrupt their essentially insurance-driven boxes.
Yeah. There's definitely, right. So insurance is definitely a player here, which is not something that I went into in great detail, but there is this, but what you're getting at is the crux of the book, right? This is the crux of biolegitimacy. We have social ideas of what a man's body should be and what a woman's body should be. And there's a significant breakdown in medical care when a patient disrupts that connection between identity and expected body, right? And so it comes up for trans men when they say things like, I don't want a hysterectomy, I might want to have children. I might want to bear children, right? Now, you know, when I was writing this book in 2015 as my dissertation, right? It's taken a new form since then, but initially, so this is, you know, 6 years ago, things have changed a little bit. There's some new, there's new scholarship coming out recognizing that, in fact, trans men do want to bear children sometimes, right? But the overwhelming idea is that men should not have a uterus. A man should not be able to bear children. Therefore, hysterectomy is a great choice for trans men, right? Which is something else I talk about in the book, which doesn't leave a visible scar, right? It leaves internal scarring for sure. But there's all of these moments where it's not just what you were assigned at birth, right? It's if you're telling me that you are this gender and telling me being the healthcare provider, right? If you're telling me that you are this gender, then this is the care that is going to ensure that you have the body that matches that gender. And everything else breaks down, right? All of the things that we think that medicine is about, do no harm, patient-centered care, evidence-based medicine, these words that the medical profession stands on, they break down when you start looking at these experiences and all of these cases all together. And so there's a breakdown there, and also this inability of the medical profession to sort of understand what they're doing to people's bodies from the perspectives of the patients, right? And part of that is a refusal to see or an inability to understand what scars mean to folks when they're happening, whether by choice or not.
Yeah, I think if you break it down to the level of the boxes, you actually get to an entry point that could be a starting point for your next project, which is to say the first thing they still ask is sex. They don't ask about gender, right? Mm-hmm. You walk into a doctor's office and you have a choice. And they never, I can walk in looking like me and they're not going to say very often, Ms., Mr., they just leave it alone. But if I walk into a gas station, 80% of the time somebody calls me Mr. So you know that within that boxed system, we drive people from the lobby of the medical office into the patient encounter into boxes that do not fit every single person who is encountering them. And I would push you to look at insurance, because while there are, of course, trans men who don't want to have hysterectomy, there are also trans men who would really like to have them and are denied insurance coverage and therefore can't afford it. It's also a very invasive procedure, and so much of sex alteration is very invasive. It requires a lot of time off from work. So people can't pay their bills or they lose their insurance. And the way in which insurance determines gender performance is actually an important piece of your discussion of biolegitimacy and biocitizenship. Because if you cannot do the surgical transition you would like because you can't afford it, there's a big class issue. And of course, Leslie Feinberg really discussed this many years ago in Stone Butch Blues.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so in this insurance issue, it like all of them, they all bleed out into other things, right? So there are particular insurance issues for trans folks trying to access care, which are very real. And they play out in the breast cancer dialogue too, the discourse there, which one of the cases I talk about in the book, I include some media cases, right? So there's this case of Raymond Johnson, who is a cis man who had breast cancer and couldn't afford medical care because his insurance wouldn't cover it because he wasn't a woman, right? So then we see the passage of the Breast Cancer Act where suddenly breast cancer care is supposed to be freely available to anybody, male or female, who is diagnosed. But in that act, it also includes access to breast reconstruction. And then and now we have this push of doctors trying to get folks to have breast reconstruction when they don't want it. So the insurance issues are incredibly complicated, just in terms of sort of policy and legislation. And then when you get into the economics of it, that's an even bigger complicating factor to consider, right? So these flows of money and sort of policies of what's allowed and what's not allowed, and how that pertains to privilege and the ability to exercise choice in these systems is incredibly fraught, for sure.
Well, as you look forward in your research and to your next project, I keep talking about your next project, which isn't to say that I don't think this is wonderful. I just felt like there were so many doors to go through from here. What would you say about this idea of unequal treatment, not by gender, but actually just on the idea of the kind of cancer that you have? So it's not just it's a mismatch, right? If you're a biological male who has a female disease, you're going to have trouble whether you present as feminine or masculine. And if you're a biological woman who has a traditionally masculine cancer, you're going to have trouble there too. So it suggests to me that there's actually this fundamental alignment in the medical mind between gender and pathology. And you know. Go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say, so the part of this issue, right, is that there's this growing notion in the medical community that medicine should be gender specific, right? And this has a long history, right? We can think about medical research that, clinical research that only tested, new drugs or treatments or whatever on, straight white men, right? And we know that that's not a great idea, right? And so there's sort of been this pendulum swing from everything can only be tested on straight white men because, there are less fluctuations or whatever nonsense reasons, right? To all medicine should be gender-based and specific to the gender, right? And we see this with things like race-based medicine too. There's these different things happening. And so then we end up with these situations where there are sort of breakdowns in medical care because often the medical community doesn't really have a good idea of what gender is and isn't, and doesn't really understand how the type of care provided plays into what gender is and isn't. And so these things that you're speaking about, right, have a lot of roots in this notion of gender-specific medicine. And there are people who specifically practice gender-specific medicine, but even the ones who don't are doing it in implicit ways, consciously or not. So there are threads, right, that are permeating throughout kind of all medical care. And some of the folks I interviewed talked about them, right? So there was one trans man I interviewed, and he talked a lot about some foot issues he was having, right? His feet have nothing to do with his gender, but the doctors always turned it into something. It's like, oh, well, it's women's biomechanics are different and that's your problem, right? So because they were reading him as assigned female at birth rather than as a man, and making all of these assumptions that didn't actually help the treatment, right? So it's not just about the obvious parts, right? Breasts and uteri and cervices and all these things, right? It's the whole body becomes gendered in these very strange ways in medical care.
Certainly that's true of knees. I can tell you there's an obsession with female knee injuries because theoretically our quads are stronger than our hamstrings. And if only women would go spend more time doing hamstring lifts, then they would be strong enough to not just succumb to the weakness of their biologically inferior knees. But so my final question for you is, what would you like people to take away from this book? It's a really strongly argued and articulate sense of many complicated concepts. So can you give us a couple of ideas that you would really want people to think about leaving this? Because I know I have a lot of them. So what did you want me to think?
Yeah, well, it's more like I would just wanted to think with people. So it's really interesting to hear from different folks what resonates, right? Because there are lots of different threads in this book. I think, sociologist me can sort of answer in different kinds of ways, but as just a person in the world who spent hours and hours and hours and hours listening to people's stories, told through laughter, through tears, right, through all of these emotions, I think the thing that I want people to take away is that I'd like for all of us, since we're all patients at some point, to recognize that patients have power. We do know our bodies. And the idea of medical authority can be resisted, right? We have plenty of knowledge and authority. But more than anything else, I would say to all of us as patients is that when we stay quiet, that's when medical authority does us harm, frankly, and puts us in positions that we don't feel like we can navigate. And so, you know, many of the folks who decided to share their stories with me had found sort of support groups, like for women who live flat, for example, or were parts of different communities that where they realized that they could, that their experiences weren't an anomaly, right? That there were patterns, that other people shared them, and that if enough people speak up, then we start to change things. And to the medical community, I would say, please read some sociology, read some medical history, and take it seriously, right? You know, I do other work in sort of, you know, epistemology and whatnot. And often what we see from the scientific community, the medical community, is a resistance to other people sort of noticing what's going on and holding up a mirror, right? And rather than being defensive and uncomfortable about that, I would implore the medical community to listen to your patients, listen to those of us outside of the medical community who care a great deal and would like to see it do better service to patients, right? And I don't mean to demonize the medical community at all. But I think there are significant breakdowns in medical education and continuing medical education in particular, that if those are addressed, we would suddenly be in a situation where a lot of these situations happen differently. And so, you know, we've seen, you know, changes to the MCAT recently where there's now a sociology section and a psychology section, I think, and that's a good start, but it's not good enough, right? It's really base level, right? I'd like to see pre-med programs require history and sociology classes, right? We need to put these things in the social context, right? We need to root them in the people and places where medical care occurs if we want these institutions to really do no harm, right? If we want that to be the case, then we have to give the medical profession the tools to make it happen. So those are my takeaways.
Well, thank you very much. I found this to be a fascinating book and really thought-provoking, and I think is going to inform a lot of my conversations with students, and some of whom are doctors. So I look forward to those conversations, and I'm really very grateful to you for having done the work. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much for reading and for asking such great questions.
Well, thank you. Great book.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. That was really great, really fascinating and important discussion. And I want to thank you both for being here. Buy the book, the link is in the chat. I want to thank our funders. I have a slide. Thank you to our funders. A video of this event, as well as previous events of ours, will be on our website, wab.org. You can also find upcoming readings and conversations like this. So I want to thank everyone for coming and have a great night. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Take care.